Hello, everyone. Welcome to this newest webinar of museumexpert.org. The title is How Do Museums Resist? And we have an exceptional panel today that we are really grateful to all of them to have joined us today. You have seen their bios over the last days, but I just remind you, we have uh, Anne Burroughs, who is the CEO of the Japan American National Museum in California. Neil Barkley, who is the president CEO of the Charles Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit. Stephanie Brown, who is more an academic. She's assistant program director of museum studies at Johns Hopkins. Barry Joseph is the director of a small museum in New York City. And then Gretchen Jennings, she is consultant and founder of Museums Act Together Substack. So how did we get here? Maybe some of you know us and some don't. I'm not going to do the whole history, but the mission of Museum Expert is to help people having fulfilling careers in museums. And the least we can say is that over the last months, this is something that has been seriously under threat for various reasons, but mostly from a lot of executive orders that were issued by the government. And we have inquired with our members to feel how they think these things affect them, these executive orders affect them, and how it feels to work in a museum these days. And a very large majority, including CEOs, said that they felt not comfortable or totally uncomfortable to work in a museum at this point in time. And of course, when it goes to the very specifics of which executive orders they really are hurting them, they speak about the work of DOGE and of the measures about DEI and the suppression of the possibility of DEI programs. But we didn't leave it there. We said, well, if you could mitigate the impact of that, how do you think that we could react to that? Could you do that on an individual level? Your museum should do something, or should the field as a whole react to that? And 90% of the answers and the large majority said, we're expecting a field-wide response. And that was so amazing to me. And I thought it was a very nice and important statement. So we tried to bring together the networks of museums to see if there was a possibility to create something global. And we must say that we were not very successful in that. And the hope is not gone. Of course, we can still work on that in the future, and I hope it will. But then globally, it didn't work. But when we found a number of individuals like those that you see on your screen today who have done things, who have been standing up, and we have brought them together today to share their experience with you, to see if that inspires us or you for doing similar action, and to see if there are really actions that we can undertake globally that are significant and that are effective and that people can stand behind. So that's the whole setup of this meeting. It's ambitious, but we have a great group, and I'm sure that it will work fine. So let me start here by asking Anne first, because Anne was the first to make a statement in February already about the impact of these executive orders and why she wouldn't really obey by them necessarily. So Anne, tell us how these measures have impacted your institution and what was your response?
Thank you. Thank you, Walter. It's wonderful to be here. It's wonderful to be with all of these amazing panelists, and just, greetings to everybody online. It's so encouraging to see so many folks who've attended. So I'll sort of try and kick this off first. It's always a little bit daunting being the first, but I'm happy to do it. For us at the Japanese American National Museum, it was really It was really our trustees, in conjunction with staff, obviously, who took an incredibly strong position literally within 2 weeks of January 20th, and in the middle of February came out with a very strong statement, which I believe was probably the first of its kind in the country. And I'll just explain to you a little bit about what the genesis of this was. Of course, we all, reacted, and we were all just aghast at what was happening at the time. But, at the Japanese American history, for all of our trustees, their parents or their grandparents were incarcerated. So for them, it was a very easy step to come out with an incredibly strong statement on the defense of history, democracy, and civil rights. Because, with those first executive orders, even although they don't have the force of law, at the same time, there was also the reintroduction of discriminatory laws, or the reimposing of discriminatory laws that were used historically, certainly against the Japanese American community and other communities. And, for our trustees, it was, there was this sort of avalanche. At first it was it was the birthright, the attacks on birthright citizenship. It was the attacks on DEI. It was the attacks on the Alien the Alien Enemies Act, all of which were used against Japanese Americans and used against other people of color. And, for our trustees, there was an obligation, a historic obligation, both to their parents, their grandparents, but also to the purpose of our museum, which has really always been to stand as a beacon to ensure that history is never forgotten, and that it never happens to anybody else. And here it seemed that it was going to be happening very quickly, and particularly with, at that point, the building of the detention centers in Guantanamo, the use of, or the lack of due process in enforcing, immigration laws. And, the other thing that compelled, I think, our trustees to stand up was that in 1942, nobody stood up for Japanese Americans when, when their parents were forcibly removed, dispossessed, and incarcerated for the duration of the war. So there was this, I think, incredibly strong obligation to stand up and be there for for other communities. And then the other thing too, just in terms of DEI, our mission is founded on this notion of diversity. And, we celebrate the richness of the cultural and ethnic diversity of this country. So, for us to turn our backs on diversity would be sort of turning our backs on, exactly who we are. So, there was that. And then also we have a very, very deep commitment, and we can talk about it later in the program, but a very deep commitment to, building the civic space and ensuring that the civic space is as vibrant as it possibly can be, and really how we can use that how we can use that civic space as a galvanizing force to have people come together to talk about differences and to talk about the issues that unite us rather than divide us. So that was just the legal side. Then of course came all of the funding cuts. And for us, that was, 10% of our budget immediately gone. We're looking at potentially 20%. But for our trustees, again, and for all of us, we're not prepared if the funding is reinstated and it comes with stringent conditions. We would have to think very seriously about whether we would take that, because it would put us in a very difficult moral position if we were required to scrub our websites and change what we do.
Thank you. And sorry, and you mentioned all the time the trustees and their personal history that makes them take these positions. But I believe, and maybe some of people here in the webinar know about this, you have a personal history as well. You are coming from South Africa, and as far as I know, you have been an activist for civil rights there, and you have been in prison yourself. Is that something that has helped you here, or inspired you, or guided you in what you're doing?
Yes, I mean, it certainly, changed my life and changed who I was. I was, as a young activist, I was I was imprisoned in South Africa as a political prisoner. So, I mean, for me, I have this incredibly deep awareness of, of authoritarianism and what that looks like, and, the tactics and the warning signs, and what the impact of that can be on a society, and how unbelievably chilling that could be, the paralysis, the silence and the fear. And I would also say that, coming from South Africa, I absolutely understand what happens when truth is suppressed and when history is erased. But also, I understand the incredible power of solidarity, nationwide solidarity and global-wide solidarity. And I think we find ourselves now in that extraordinary place. And we have this opportunity as museums, and I think we are already, to stand together, and we are, as this incredibly strong force standing up for our principles, for our missions, and for what we believe in, and for, the communities that we serve, who are being impacted. So all of those things certainly have given me a very strong perspective.
Thank you for that, and thanks for sharing it with our audience here. I want to go to Neil now, and Neil, you have also a very specific museum in this case, because it's really dedicated to the history of African Americans in this country, and they have been especially under attack with executive orders. We know what the Smithsonian is undergoing, and there is this direct threat to the narrative that people may have in African American history museums. Can you talk us a little bit about what's happening in your museum and how you think you should react to that?
Yes, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to all of you. I guess I would say first and foremost that, this current moment is not a new one for African Americans. Our history in this country has been one that has been replete with efforts to either erase our history, erase our humanness, our human dignity, to erase the contributions that we've made to the American ideal and to the democratic ideal as it's known around the world, frankly. And so this moment just reminds us of the critical nature of the work that we do, which is about lifting up the stories of how, in particular, our culture, African Americans, how critical we have been and seminal, frankly, we have been to the American experiment, whether it's in First Amendment rights, who can or cannot be a citizenship, who can or cannot vote. All of those issues are deeply entwined with the experience of African Americans. And so this moment of executive orders is regrettably not a surprising one for students of history, and I'm also trained as an attorney, so students of law. These are very common tactics that authoritarian regimes do to undermine the ability of the people to be to live out what we know as a democratic way of life. And so it wasn't surprising, many of them. We were impacted somewhat financially in the sense that we had IMLS grants, NEA grants. We even had grants pending before the EPA with some of our sustainability work.
Mhm.
All of those were canceled. But it doesn't fundamentally change who we are, right? And the work that we do. I'm sometimes amused by the conversation around DEI because it's a construct that most people cannot define accurately, right? If you ask them what does it mean, they will give you all kinds of definitions of what a DEI program is or what its intent is. But there's no confusion about the intent of African American museums and BIPOC museums like ours. We exist to be able to remind people how it is that all cultures have contributed deeply and significantly to what we understand to be the democratic ideal, and that those values, those ideas are not going to go away because of an executive order. They are built into the DNA of who we are and why we exist, and it will continue to be. We have existed without resources. Post George Floyd's murder, we got a few more resources, but we're not confused about the fact of all of those resources contribute to us being able to do work, a certain kind of work that is imbued with a certain kind of values, and that will continue. So I wasn't surprised. I'm somewhat surprised by the extent of it. That is a little disconcerting, meaning the extent of the orders, particularly as it relates to African American history and culture, the threat that it seems to present to know more about, the issues that we've been so engaged with in our lives since we came to these shores. But again, it's a moment of reminding us that our work is not done. I was inspired recently by a conversation that Angela Davis and Kenneth Coates were having at the University of Michigan about civil rights movements and activist movements. And what Ms. Davis reminded us is that those movements do not move in a straight line, that there will be times where they'll have to come back somewhat to remember a core idea, a core, how can I say it, way of working through the challenges that we find in our society in order to make it better. But that ultimately we do end up in a better place. She reminded me of when she started as an activist that there was not a word for women's rights, right? There was not a movement really afoot. Women's suffrage, yes, but what did you call sexism, for example, back in this? Was that a concept that really even existed in our mind? And I think of our LGBTQ brothers and sisters, how those ideals have developed over time, and I think that's where we find ourselves at this moment. I think I'll
Thank
leave
you,
it
Neil.
there. I
Oh,
obviously have a lot more to say about this topic, but I will.
no, no. I was wondering, do you have any specific idea about specific topics that the administration would like to erase from the history of African Americans?
Well, they seem to want to have us forget that African Americans were enslaved,
Hmm.
that were brought to this country as enslaved people, that they were not brought to this country by and large of our own free will. That's the one thing that they're very keen about erasing because, as some of the opponents of that philosophy or exponents of that philosophy would suggest, it makes them feel bad. We felt pretty bad about it as well. So we agree with them on that point, right? But that seems to be one of the sticking points. And the fact that I think African Americans were so central to the citizenship discussions that resulted in the 14th Amendment, or voting rights that resulted in the 15th Amendment, or the ERA, even, that women, and particularly Black women, were engaged in securing the right of women to vote. How intrinsic our communities were in each of those efforts, right? And they want us to forget that and to believe that somehow only one group of people contributed to those concepts, those values that are so much a part of who we are, right? Um,
Thank you.
that's my sense, but there could be others as well.
That's okay. So we may come back to that later in the program. I'd like to ask Barry. You are a very small museum, but you're also teaching, and I know that you have done some actions with your students, and you have discussed with your museum studies students about what was going on. And uh, I'd like to hear from you what you exactly did and what it resulted. And I think the important part of that is, and that's how we met, is that you in particular joined the hands-off movement with your students, and that's something that we had called for to do so as museums. to express the solidarity that Anne was speaking about before, that this needed solidarity. So tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Walter, and thanks for asking me to be here today. I'm quite humbled to be part of this incredible panel, and I hope there's some small piece I can add to the conversation. Walter's asking about what happened for me. What was the date? I have the date right in front of me. April 1st. April 1st was when, on a Tuesday, I went in to meet with my students. It was just a few days after the executive order entitled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History was issued by the current administration. I teach a course at New York University. It's in the education department. I teach pretty much a digital design and museums class. These are graduate students, master's students who are either interested in working in the museum space or want to add museum skill sets to whatever else they're doing. Maybe they're game designers, maybe they're more technologists. When I start the course, I start by talking about museums, by helping them to understand that museums didn't grow naturally out of the ground, that they're human constructions. And I kind of do a sociological challenge. I suggest to them, if museums suddenly disappeared, not that they went away, but as if they never were, where would they need to disappear from? And that's the question. And then I just challenge them for 20 minutes just to list all the places where one experiences museums as represented in movies, as a thing you go to with your teacher in school, as something you might bring your friends to when they're coming in from out of town, as new research that's discovered that is written about in the newspaper. And it's just looking at all the ways that we will museums into being. We reify them and define what they are through all of those things. So on April 1st, when I came in, I had something else planned. And the student said right in the beginning, you sent something on our Slack this weekend. Can we talk about that instead? And luckily, I thought that might bring it up. And so what I did is I brought in a copy of the executive order, and I brought in everything I'd gotten the last week that had to do with it. Messages from my elected officials here in New York City, New York State, messages from the field, from AAM, for example, and as well as articles that were describing it, both supporting it and criticizing it. And what I shared with them was that the language that we use around what museums are, the metaphors we use, they tell us what museums are or could be, and the value they bring or don't to society. So I provided some context for understanding that to that date, everything we've been hearing from the administration that was critical and taking action against federal departments was done under the auspices of reducing and becoming more efficient, reducing funds and becoming more efficient. But that none of that language is what was being used in the new executive order. That in fact, it was something different than we were hearing. That in fact, it was about, again, as it says in the title, it's about restoring truth. It is establishing that museums have a role of saying what is true in society. And this order wasn't about reducing their role, but redirecting that role, which is to say using museums as a form of propaganda by whatever the dominant power is. But beyond that, my role wasn't to critique it as a professor. It was just to say this is the historical context, that the role of what museums should or shouldn't be around the dominant messages of power in society didn't start that past weekend, that's been an ongoing battle since the history of museums. I referenced that when we started talking about the history of museums, they were things owned by the merchants and the wealthy to show off their collections, to kind of acquire and have a sense of ownership over the world. And that this is not new, but what's new is this current battle. And to understand that battle, what we need to do is look at all those documents and do a deep textual analysis. And so we got out our highlighters, we got out all the documents I described, and the challenge was find everywhere in these documents where someone's making a case for what a museum is. It is a place that reinforces our values in society. It is a place that people found that brings revenue through tourism. And looking at all those things, because those are the things that define for us what a museum is and give us the place to make our arguments and defend what we think is valuable. And we did that not to show that there were two sides, because many of the arguments for those who would agree with the current administration's decision and those opposed to it have the same definitions for museums. Both were using language that said museums play an important role in society. Both said museums play a role in representing what is valuable to society and articulating that. The difference is what we think those values should be. Using that as the point of discussion, let us move back from exactly what's happening in the moment, as Neil was doing, historicizing it, as Anna was doing as well, historicizing these battles. It let us historicize this conversation specifically around museums, showing that it's always ongoing, and looking at that, therefore, what can we do now? It means looking at those places where we agree. Look at the places where, whether you agree or not with the executive decision, where do we agree about the role of what museums are? So we can start with that commonality and then build on that and say, well, therefore, if we agree here, how can we move it towards what we think is important for museums to be effective, to be able to be voices for many voices, to be accurate, to be evidence-based, right? Which are not always the language that we saw in the other documents. So by doing this activity, it gave, I think, my students some hope, who again are hoping to move into the museum field as early as next year, that there is a different way to approach defending museums in this space. There's other battles that need to happen around the economics of it. Don't get me wrong. I don't mean to eschew that. But in this one slice about helping people know they can stand up, to get regular citizens to stand up, whether they're going to a protest rally or they're calling elected officials, we need to be cognizant of what is it that we're saying makes museums valuable, so we can make sure we're talking on the same page about what it is that we're defending and what we'll lose if we don't win this battle.
Thank you, Barry. So I'd like to go to Stephanie now, and it's like a natural type of move from one professor to another. And you have some experience as well with students in discussing particular museums and democracy. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah, thank you. And it's such a pleasure to be able to be here today with all of you. So I am the assistant program director for the Johns Hopkins Museum Studies program, and we are close colleagues with folks at NYU and their Museum Studies program. Our program is a little bit different because it is it came into being as a digital program, as an online program, and we've been teaching online for much longer than since 2020. And what that means is that we have a national reach. And so we have students, we have alums who are working in county museums, in Alabama. We have students and alums who are working in Florida, working in New York, we've got folks at the Smithsonian, and we've got folks at the local museum 2 blocks from where I live. And so that has colored, I think, my perspective of what the field is going through right now, and what I imagine we're going to continue to go through, and I think it's probably going to get more so. My students, my colleagues feel enormous uncertainty, enormous anxiety, a distress about what's coming down in these EOs, distress about what's going on at IMLS and EH and EA. But nobody's leaving, everybody's still coming to work. I mean, unless they've been laid off, which so far it seemed, people retain their commitment to the work that we do. I was at American Alliance of Museums conference last month in LA, and what struck me was that we all came together, and the conversations in the hallways, and those are always the biggest conversations that you have at a big conference, right? It's the conversation when you bump into people and you meet somebody else, and they're about, how are we going to get through this? They're about, what are we doing right now? And, museums have always been underfunded. We've never gotten all the money that we needed, right? A lot of us also have really terrible work-life boundaries, right? We're going to show up. We're going to keep showing up. What I see, I've got a couple examples. We have an alum who's the director of a county museum in Southeast Montana. And during which is, a fairly conservative place. during COVID, their museum created a traveling exhibition about a native Montana man who went off into the wide world and became a doctor and discovered vaccinations or invented vaccinations. I don't know whether you discover or invent vaccinations, but they made all these vaccinations that are like the vaccinations that we give our kids. They made this traveling exhibition about vaccinations during this time when, you know, there was all this, oh my God, vaccinations, you know, everybody's gonna whatever, whatever, whatever. And it traveled all around the state. So this little bitty museum, right, with staff of like 2.5, created this traveling show to talk about the importance of vaccinations in a time when vaccinations were incredibly political, and they just did their thing. I talked to my colleague there last month, and she told me that the Bozeman County school district or city school district had reached out to them and asked if they could have that exhibit on loan because measles was showing up in the schools. So that's how I think that's how we do this work, you know. Another example, I have colleagues at the Invisible Histories Project in they're in Alabama right now. They're moving to North Carolina. They collect, preserve, present the histories of the LGBTQ community in the Deep South. There is a history. There's a rich and deep history. And at the beginning of this calendar year, when all of this nonsense started coming out of DC, first thing they did was reach out to other organizations in the Deep South that had collections or that had information on their websites about their history. And they started to collect it and preserve it before it could be taken down, before it could be recycled, before it could be disappeared. They started to pull it all together. And that took, it took knowing their community, it took having relationships, and it took being brave and being proactive. And I think that's what we're called to do right now. Maybe we close the museums and we all go out in the street and have a big protest. I don't think that the people in DC really care what museum staff think. But I think that the people in our neighborhoods and the people in our communities do care. They care because they know us and maybe they trust us. And I think that's where we have our strength. So
you addressed two important questions that I want to come back to immediately, but I want to give the chance to Gretchen to make her point, because Gretchen is an observer of the museum field also very globally for a long time, and she has started a new initiative to bring stories like you just expressed of what Anne or Neil have been telling, and to bring them together. And Gretchen, can you tell us about your initiative?
Tell me about, pardon, what?
About your initiative, about your...
Yes, certainly. Yeah, well, I agree with the previous two speakers on how important it is for us to keep doing what we do, and especially in those areas that kind of push back against the culture. But one of the things that I became aware of early on in listening to some of the webinars about the current situation was, it seemed as though there was a lack of awareness of how serious this was throughout the country. I think there was a lot of focus on what was going on in DC, and I began to think, well, I live in kind of a bubble here where perhaps what's happening to the Smithsonian or IMLS is so urgent, but I wasn't picking up the sense of urgency or the idea of even understanding what seemed to be going on more globally in the United States simply. And so one of the things I began to do was to look at state legislatures. And what I found was that particularly in red states, and maybe with the kind of the zeitgeist of what the administration was doing, there were plenty of examples of censorship and defunding going on in places like Louisiana and Alabama and New Hampshire and Texas. So this attack that we see in many authoritarian organizations, where one of the first places they go is to museums, I thought it was happening. And so I decided, well, maybe having some kind of a Substack would be useful. And I looked at museum Substack examples, and I found many museum postings, but none about the current situation, none about, and I wasn't hearing words like resist or solidarity. And so after talking to a number of people, I decided, along with my colleague Rose Paquette, to start a Substack called Museums Act Together. And the purpose of that would be twofold. One, to provide as much information as we could in each post. And right now we're only doing a couple of posts a month, but we're trying to provide state by state information on censorship and defunding. And then the second thing was to promote solidarity, because I think without solidarity, those of us acting individually, this is not going to be successful. If you look at the experts that I follow, like Timothy Snyder and Maria Reza and M. Gesson, all of whom have either lived through authoritarian regimes or who have studied them, they talk about resisting and resisting early, and also about solidarity, about communicating with one another. And so this is the reason for the Substack. And I urge those of you who have joined it to help contribute by sending us information, and also by sharing your stories of ways in which you have successfully resisted, even in small ways. I'm hoping that Anne will talk about the scrub nothing motto that you've come up with, and how powerful that is as a symbol and as a fundraiser for your organization. And I hope other museums can do the same thing.
Well, maybe that's a direct question, Anne. What do you say?
To me.
Yeah, you got a direct question. So go ahead.
So, when we were seeing the, the various attempts to erase history, and exactly what we've heard Stephanie talk about, a little bit earlier on, and also Neil, and then there was also this, this idea that that you had to scrub your websites, part of sort of trying to conform with, the DEI executive orders, which of course, all of those things, we know that they don't have the weight of the law. But, it's part of that thing of instilling fear. And the chair of our board of trustees at our annual gala, in fact, no, it wasn't even at our annual, he was in an interview. And he was basically saying that, JANM will scrub nothing. In other words, we will not scrub our websites. And it's just become this meme, and we've got T-shirts and the whole thing. And it's become really quite a powerful campaign for us. And it's also been enormously powerful as a fundraising tool, without even it intending to be a fundraising tool, because I think that, in the early days of all of this, people didn't know what to do. There was such a sense of paralysis, and even by sort of making small contributions, it almost felt like, like an act of resistance. But, if I could also just jump in here and talk about this issue of solidarity and how we can organize around that. I'd spoken to Walter about this, and I think it's probably a good time to mention it, and I'll mention it very quickly, is that we're actually trying to build a coalition of museums to investigate the strategy of doing a class action on behalf of museums who've had funding cuts, and those would be funding cuts through NEA, NEH, or IMLS. We could go two ways. We could either do it on the money, because those are broken contracts, and we've all had affirmative contracts by having those grants awarded. The other way would be around First Amendment, and that's really about the requirements and the expectations and the pressure to change what we do. But I think it's probably going to be more feasible to do it around the issue of funding cuts and the rescission of funding, because it's an attack on the cultural space. It's an attack on what we do. So I'm just putting that out there. We're exploring that possibility. At the moment, it would be a pro bono funded or pro bono driven class action. But at the moment, there are no class actions on behalf of museums. There was the IMLS was the class action that that Democracy Forward brought, and that the attorneys general brought was on behalf of libraries, but there's nothing yet on behalf of museums.
Thanks for that, and I hope we can come back to that at the end and suggest that as one of the outcomes of this meeting. And I had a number of other questions. I'm going to bring them together in one because we don't have much time anymore. Is that we hear, and I really appreciate that, don't think that I'm criticizing it, but doing the job as usual is a sort of resisting right now. But in my opinion, you cannot necessarily do your job as usual. And I give you one example. If NOAA is not able to provide any scientific information to the museums, how can they find correct data in science museums to speak about climate change? So the situation is not necessarily a normal situation in which doing your job as usual is an act of resistance. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, and that is being said also, somehow addressed, I think by Stephanie, very importantly, is we say that museums are linked to their communities, and Neil has mentioned that as well. But the communities are also under threat of many different things. So how can museums show that they actually stand behind their communities beyond doing their job as usual? So this is for everyone. Who else wants to answer that? Neil.
So I perhaps business as usual is not the right term for what we're doing now. I think museums for some time have been undergoing a kind of transformation from being that place where people go to either get information or look at pretty pictures on a wall to gathering places and places where our communities gather to wrestle with the critical issues of our day, right? The Wright Museum, for example, is the final viewing place for Aretha Franklin and Rosa Parks. So they sit and stay both in the center of our rotunda. And this is not just symbolic, it is a testament to how our museum operates as a gathering place, a central place for us to collaborate, to work together on issues that are important to us. I also think that, for history museums in particular, some of what is happening now, as I mentioned earlier, is not new. And we can be intentional about raising the relationship, the historical relationship between what is happening now and what has happened in the past in a way that I think is helpful, because it does illustrate some of the real intention, if you will, behind what is happening now, however it is couched or described, because we've seen it happen before and we've seen how it played out. We recently did an exhibit around the last election they called Voting Matters, and it wasn't just an attempt to get people to vote. It was an attempt to understand how critical a vote can be in certain kinds of races, whether they be local, regional, or national, to unpack what an electoral college is and how that affects our voting. There are things that we can do that are more intentionally grounded in the work that we do that I think is really important for us to lift up in this moment.
Thank you, Neil. I think that Gretchen wanted to say something about this.
Well, I wanted to support Anne's announcement that there might be a class action effort. And certainly if there's anything that we can do in terms of publicizing it on the Substack, we would want to do that. But I think just this morning in the Post, or I guess last night, there was an article by Philip Kennicott, the Pulitzer Prize winning art critic at the Post, talking about the role that the Smithsonian really needs to play in leading resistance, and also admitting how difficult a situation the Smithsonian is in right now, Lonnie, as well as the board of directors. But I just wanted to read what his last sentence, or paragraph. There's no middle road. Appeasement won't work. The fate of the Smithsonian is now in the hands of Bunch and the Regents, and the precedent they set will reverberate throughout every institution in America that, like the Smithsonian, is dedicated to the increase and diffusion of knowledge. So I also think that saying more publicly what Barry talked about with his class, we are valuable, we are important, we owe our citizens this effort. I feel as a citizen that if museums don't stand up for me, I'm going to lose a lot. I'm not going to lose my job because I'm retired and I can speak out, and I'm not going to be punished. But I still am going to lose tremendously if museums don't somehow stand together and forge unified action. So I think that this idea of the class action suit is wonderful.
So thanks. We have two conversations now going on at the same time, which is fine. So Stephanie, can you actually first react to my statement about job as usual is not necessarily the right answer now, and then the reaction as proposed by Anne and Gretchen here, or by Anne actually.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. Thank you.
Yeah.
What a fabulous idea. I mean, of course, there should be a class action lawsuit. I'm so glad you guys are so smart and you're so on top of everything, and thank you. I want to talk about what Neil was saying, and I've been to the Charles Wright, and I've sat in that amazing atrium, and it might make you happy to know, Neil, that I sat in that atrium and I had conversations with strangers about the exhibit. So, as museum people, that's what you're always looking for, is conversations with strangers, right?
Absolutely.
But what resonated so much with me was thinking about Rosa Parks and Aretha Franklin having their final spot there in their viewing in your museum. One of my daughters lives outside of Detroit, and when she first moved there, I remember driving down there are like thousands of highways in Detroit, and one of them, there was a Rosa Parks Boulevard exit, and I thought, oh my God, Rosa Parks is buried here. And so I made my daughter come with me to the cemetery so we could go pay our respects. And we also saw Aretha Franklin's interment. Why am I telling you this? I'm telling you this because this is something that we, as museum people, as people who work in culture, as people who value culture and value critical thinking, this has to just be part of our lives. It's not something that we just talk about, on social media. It's what we need to do every day and think about every day. And there's space both for a class action suit, that's super important, and there's space for having conversations with strangers. And I think that, the administration's way of operating is to sow chaos, right? It's sow chaos, sow panic. Oh my God, look what happened today. Oh my God, what are we going to do? And I mean, that's insulting, as intelligent grown-ups. That's an insulting way to be treated. And we don't have to accept that. I mean, that it's there, it's not going to go away, but we don't have to panic every time somebody says panic. And I think that, we carry on doing our work as a way of keeping in mind, yeah, all this ridiculousness is going on, but we're going to keep having these exhibits, and we're going to keep not scrubbing anything. And, we're still going to be here. The Smithsonian, oh my God, every day I think about Secretary Bunch. And I think, first of all, thank God that I will never be the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution. And secondly, I hope he's safe, and I hope he's getting some sleep, and I hope he's taking care of himself. And I think he's in an impossible position. The Smithsonian's in an impossible position, but I mean, we've all watched his work for years. We've all seen what he's done at Smithsonian, and I don't know what's going on, but I think something is, and I trust them. And while they're doing their stuff, I'm going to keep doing my stuff.
So before we go to the questions, there are a couple of questions that Colleen mentioned to me. And how can you wrap up the answer about not doing or doing the job as usual, and then taking action globally or in solidarity with others? How does that match?
Was that for anyone, Walter?
Oh yeah, if you want to feel, yeah.
I think it's both. I mean, I think people wonder what they can do. They can continue to do the work that they've done so expertly for decades, right? And, from teaching the students that Barry and Stephanie are doing to the work that we do in museums, that work has to continue. That work is critical at this point for those of us who are doing to continue. But I do think there is power, as we've seen in civil rights movements and women's rights movements throughout our history, in solidarity, in doing something as a sector towards these goals or values that we so respect, honor, and are so much a part of who we are. I think there's a both and possibility there. I like including this notion of doing our work as usual, because it's something that individuals can do. People say, I don't know what to do now. I don't have, well, do more of what you were doing. It's really important now. It's more important than it's ever been, right? But yes, then there may be a more global answer in a class action suit or other kinds of mechanisms for us to have our voices heard more broadly.
Thank you. So I'm looking at the time, and so we don't have a lot left. So I'm going to go to Colleen and ask her if there are any questions in the chat. And before you do that, I want to say I had an eye on the chat as well while we were discussing. The chat, we keep the chat, and I think there is very important information in there, and people inviting for activities that they do. So if you ask us, we will share the chat with you. You can have it. Because in the recording of the webinar, it's not going to be visible there, but if you ask us, we will share the chat with you. So, Colleen, what is the audience thinking or asking?
Sure, I've got two questions. So I'm hoping we can get through both of them. First, there was gratitude for a lot of Anne's comments in the JANM work, but a question of are there specific steps that JANM is taking to share resources or take action alongside of immigrants or immigrant right groups? And I would think this would apply to any marginalized group, but Anne.
Sure. Well, even although we are the Japanese American National Museum, we work very closely with, a diversity of groups, particularly in the API community. And, just yesterday, for example, we had Rob Bonta, the California Attorney General, come to speak about the role that states attorneys general are taking the role that they're playing in upholding the law. And a key piece of that actually was around immigrants and immigrant rights and, the lack of due process that's being used at the moment. And we had, so we're not working specifically with immigrant communities in terms of, providing them support or direct stuff. We are, trying to share resources that we get from our partner organizations that are much, much better equipped at, you know, defending and providing specific information around rights than we are. But, you know, we have, you know, robust social media. We have our National Center for the Preservation of Democracy, which is part of JANM, you know, where we were able to talk about issues that relate to, you know, identity, race, the fragility of democracy, immigration, ethnicity, all of those sorts of things. Thank you.
And if I could just ask one additional question to this group as a whole. One of the things that popped up in chat a couple of times was, while we of course want to keep doing what museums do so well, how do we protect our ability to continue to tell those stories when threatened with an authoritarian regime? And this is to anyone.
I'll start. Again, I think, first of all, finding solidarity, sharing your stories so that you know that you're not alone and that some of your ideas might contribute to others. One of my concerns is that I'm not sure that this Substack is really powerful enough to provide the kind of leadership that is needed to bring many museums in our country together. I think that Neil and Anne, as directors and in positions of greater authority, that maybe the Association of Museum Directors or whatever, that there some kind of effort on their part, like this class action suit, as well as other steps, I think are very important to helping all museums across the country find their way.
And quickly, what I would just add is,
Yes, please.
we are committed to improving society, especially the communities where we live and the people who visit our communities. We need to not be shy in helping them understand how they can help us back and defend the good that we bring to them, and be really clear about what those values are that we have in common.
Well, thanks. This is going to be the word of the the closing words here, Barry. It's my time here to thank first of all the panelists for their time and for their insight in these conversations. It's a difficult time, but it was really good to hear some clear point of views and some hope moving forward, that there are a number of actions going on. We certainly support Gretchen, and we will come back to you and see how Museum Expert can help you develop your initiative, and we were happy to do that and talk about that. And the same way, Anne, if there is anything that we can do to support your initiative, we will certainly be happy to do it with our limited means. But thanks again for this conversation. It's not over, and we certainly will come back to that after the summer. I'd like to thank the audience as well. We have seen a number of very incredible contributions in the chat, and hopefully people will be able to download them or to ask for us. And then I want to also thank museumexpert.org staff who is making this possible, Colleen in the first place, but not only, all the others as well. So thank you again for this conversation, and I hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to see everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Walter. Thank you, Colleen.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Thank you. You too. Take care.
Bye-bye.